when we do come to a negotiation, I would like to reinforce your point. What has happened on the battlefield will provide the basis for the agreement, and that has favored Russia, not Ukraine. Russian bargaining position is much stronger now than it was, 20 some months ago, and that has to be taken into account. I think Mr. Putin, despite all the negative propaganda designed to portray him as a fool, is not a fool.
Hello, everybody. This is still Pascal here with Ambassador Chas Freeman. And in the second segment, we want to talk about Ukraine and then also about what's happening between Xi and Biden recently. Ambassador Freeman, you told me before we talked that you are keenly observing still Ukraine and that you've noticed a considerable shift in not only the narrative but also in the politics going on the ground. As we speak today, in November 21st, 2023, what is currently going on in Ukraine, and how do you think this conflict is now changing from the US side?
Well, there are quite a few things that appear to be going on. General Valery Zaluzhny, who is the chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, has openly declared that there's a stalemate in the war. There's no prospect of recovering the lands that Ukraine has lost on the battlefield. This is a very different view than that expressed by the president, Mr. Zelensky. There are charges among Ukrainian politicians that Mr. Zelensky is either deluded or the puppet of foreign forces who are prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian. And the reality is that Ukraine has essentially run out of soldiers. The average Ukrainian in fighting the Russians now is 43 years old. There are incidents where the Russians have captured Ukrainians who've been drafted who are in their 70s. This is scraping the bottom of the barrel. There are a lot of Ukrainians of draft age who are outside Ukraine, of course. They seem to have no desire to go back to the meat grinder that the war has become. The Russians, for their part, are increasingly on the offensive. And, while the battle lines are not changing greatly, a few miles, a few kilometers here and there, the momentum is clearly passing to the Russian side, which has a vastly larger force, much more effective militarily than it was at the outset of the war. So we're hearing a lot of talk, not just abroad, but in Ukraine, about two things. One is succession to Zelensky, because he's seen as an obstacle to peace by some. Second, Zelensky is defending his position by firing generals. He just fired the head of the medical service in the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, that's his prerogative as president. He's canceled the elections. There is no democracy in Ukraine. Political parties have all been banned. It's not clear how you would have a succession. Perhaps Mr. Zelensky will withdraw and retire to his villa in Italy, or his mother-in-law's villa on the Red Sea in Egypt, or one of his villas in Cyprus. But short of that, I think he's right to be concerned about his life. Outside Ukraine, in Europe, where there was once very limited discussion of the requirement for peace between Ukraine and Russia, that is now the official position of NATO, that there must be a treaty between Ukraine and Russia. There must be a peace treaty in order for Ukraine to be considered for membership in NATO. That is the prerequisite. The EU has shifted its position. It's not clear. There's quite a split between the European Commission per se, Madame von der Leyen and on the one hand, and others, some countries like Hungary and Slovakia have clearly broken with the NATO consensus and the EU consensus. It's not clear to me where the Italians are under Meloni, but probably not clear to Miss Meloni either. Anyway, there is a lot of talk now about how to end this war, rather than endorsement of President Biden's "as long as it takes" mantra. In the United States, the Republicans are refusing to appropriate funds for Ukraine. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin just went quietly to Kyiv, presumably to talk with 𝗔𝗯ance and 𝗔𝗯ance and the others about how to cope with the end of U.S. funding, or at least its suspension. Earlier, Bill Burns, the very diplomatic head of the CIA, who is the pinch hitter, that's a baseball term, someone who is brought to the bat, brought out to hit the ball when the normal hitter, meaning Secretary Blinken, has proven unable to do so, has struck out. He was in Kyiv. So there's clearly something going on. I suspect there may be discussions going on between the Russian and Ukrainian military behind the scenes, either directly or through intermediaries. And clearly, things are quite unsettled in Kyiv. So this is a moment of great uncertainty. And that is quite different from what happened before. Kyiv has been successful militarily in projecting some power beyond its borders, damaging Russian ships, for example, forcing their redeployment to more distant bases, drone attacks on Russian military installations, including the Kremlin. But these are essentially pinpricks that have nothing to do with what is going on militarily inside Ukraine, and they don't really affect the battlefield, except that they draw Russian ripostes. They draw Russian counter-escalation. We're seeing that with the further destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. So you hear much less now about the reconstruction of Ukraine than you did. But that is becoming a very urgent problem. Ukraine has lost a huge part of its population, either on the battlefield, we don't know how many because that is classified information in Ukraine, but the estimates are in the many hundreds of thousands. And it's lost millions more to emigration. And there's no indication from those who emigrated and who are now in Poland or Germany or France or wherever, that they intend to return to Ukraine. So I think this is becoming a spectacular failure for US and NATO policy. And that too, on top of the Gaza disaster, bids fair to damage the political standing of Western leaders, especially in the UK and the US.
Now, when we think about a potential end game to the Ukraine war, I think this war, more than many others that have been going on over the last couple of maybe even decades, is a very Clausewitzian war in the sense that it is the extension of politics by other means. And I keep thinking to myself, what could be the end game? And the end game has, of course, to be what the victor on the battlefield wants it to be. And we know that Russia, from the beginning, wanted a neutral Ukraine, no NATO membership, and a security arrangement for Europe, right? And the US and Europe have consistently resisted this, and they have said, oh, it's nothing about this. It has nothing to do with realpolitik. It is because Russia is evil and is an evil empire and wants to expand. But we know that that's not true. Now, my question is, how much longer will it take until the US and the EU, and not really the EU, because the EU is the dog of the US, right? It has no will of its own. It will tag along what Washington says eventually. It will pretend not to, but then it will. But how long will it take for the US to say, fine, Russia, let's sit down and hammer out an agreement and then sign it? Do you have a timeline in mind? Because at the moment, the US still pretends that this is only between Ukraine and Russia, right? The US still pretends that it has nothing to do, it's not between Washington and Moscow, when everybody clearly understands it is Washington and Moscow, and the Russians will not accept anything short of an agreement, I believe, with Washington, unless it's, the complete submission of Ukraine to its military might.
I think that you're absolutely correct. This is a Clausewitzian war. It is the extension of politics by other means. The Russian demands from the beginning have been very limited and very clear. Neutralization of Ukraine, no membership in NATO. You could actually imagine membership in NATO that was accompanied by an agreement not to allow any foreign forces in Ukraine. That would return NATO to the defensive posture that it had during the Cold War, at least with respect to Ukraine. You could imagine that is actually pretty much the position that the Finns and Norway have traditionally taken. And Norway doesn't allow foreign forces on its territory except for exercises. I don't think Finland has any intention of allowing NATO installations on its territory. So you could come up with something of that sort. You could neutralize whatever is left of Ukraine on the model of the Austrian State Treaty, which has always been there as a potential model. It has two major merits. One is it would subtract Ukraine from any bloc. It would not interfere with joining the EU, but it would prevent membership in either a Russian or US-led sphere of influence. And it would require Ukraine to do what it failed to do after 2014, namely treat minorities, whether they're Russian speakers, Hungarian speakers, or speakers of something else, with the dignity that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe agreement requires. So Slovenes and Italians in Austria have the right to use their own language for official purposes in their regions and for education. So you could return, that was part of the Ukrainian constitution, which was suspended after the US-sponsored coup in 2014. It could be reinstated. You could have an interim arrangement that opens the possibility of reinstating the Minsk Accords, by which the various oblasts in the Donbas region and the south were to remain part of Ukraine, but to enjoy the sort of linguistic and cultural autonomy that Quebec enjoys, for example, in Canada, a federalized Ukraine, if you will. How would you do that? Well, you could agree that they be independent. Russia avoids its annexation. They become independent states for a period, an agreed period, let's say 20 years, at the end of which there's a referendum to decide, and it would be supervised by the OSCE or maybe Swiss hotel keepers or something, that would be a fair election that would determine whether they wish to remain independent, become part of Russia, or become part of Ukraine, or something else. Maybe you could invent something like the status of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. But anyway, there are many, many possibilities. What has been lacking is any effort at bringing diplomatic imagination to bear on this issue, leaving the battlefield, as you say. And when we do come to a negotiation, I would like to reinforce your point. What has happened on the battlefield will provide the basis for the agreement, and that has favored Russia, not Ukraine. Russian bargaining position is much stronger now than it was, 20 some months ago, and that has to be taken into account. I think Mr. Putin, despite all the negative propaganda designed to portray him as a fool, is not a fool. He is a very rational actor. He is capable of statesmanlike decisions. He speaks clearly. He says what he means. He means what he says. And I think he's quite capable of dealing realistically with what the battle has produced, which is, among other things, of great concern to him, or should be of great concern to him, a divorce between Europe and Russia. Can Europe and Russia recover some sort of relationship? Obviously, dealing fairly with the Ukraine issue is essential to that. And since Russia would have as an objective causing Europeans to exercise judgment independent of the United States, dealing fairly with Ukraine would bring out the differences in the American and the European perspective in a way that I think Mr. Putin might find quite attractive.
Yeah, my question is more, we know now that an early settlement of the Ukraine war in March 2022 was sabotaged by the West. And we know that the West was the one who said, we want war and we will win war, and then we can impose and we can have NATO troops at the border with Russia and Ukraine. And this is the neocons. And the neocons, in my view, they're not ready yet to actually accept the realities on the battlefield. So it's like, what do you think that inside the US something will subdue this part of, or not?
Yes, there are two possibilities, neither of which is very attractive. One is that the Republicans hold firm in the Congress and refuse to fund a continued war effort in Ukraine. This would parallel the U.S. decision to cut off funding to the government of the Republic of Vietnam in the South and to leave it on its own. I used to have a T-shirt that said Southeast Asian War Games, 1954 to 1975, second place by act of Congress. This could happen. The parliamentary function can stop wars. The second possibility is that the 2024 election goes in a different direction. Either Mr. Biden is not the Democratic candidate because he's not considered viable by the party because of his loss of support due to Gaza and to the failure in Ukraine, as well as other failures. And therefore, there's another candidate of some sort who wants to end the war. Or the 2024 election occurs and there's a new president, maybe Mr. Trump, who would not support Ukraine, or perhaps there's a third-party candidate, because what is happening in politics in the United States has eerie parallels with the 1850s, when the two-party system broke down and the Republican Party emerged from nowhere on an anti-slavery platform. Well, now there's talk of a no-labels third-party movement with no wars as a program. So, the American politics are volatile at the moment. So I think there are multiple paths to a discussion. Of course, Ukraine might just decide on its own, regardless of what others have been telling it, that it's in its interest to come to terms with Moscow. But that could happen. So I don't think the idea of some sort of peace agreement is at all unrealistic, and there are those who are prepared to participate in mediating it. China has stated principles for a peace agreement, which would be consistent with the various possibilities that I discussed. Turkey and Israel have a history of mediating. They actually produced a peace treaty in draft in late March of 2022. So I think there is also the United Nations, which has been paralyzed by the usual great power politics, the United States veto. But if the United States did not veto it, the Secretary General and company are quite capable of mediating in this context. So I don't think we lack diplomatic instruments if we're prepared to use them, but so far we're not.
Those are all very good points, and I'm working strongly on trying to sell the idea of US neutrality back to the United States, because it was using that policy very successfully for 150 years, but let's see if you're going to buy or not.